In the book of Genesis, Noah is described thus in chapter 6. Noah was a righteous man. He was blameless in his age. Rabbis reading that phrase, asked a question. What does it mean to be blameless in your age, in your door, your generation? Was he someone who would have been righteous in any generation, or was he only righteous relative to the time he lived? Rabbi Yochanan said, well, relative to the other people of his generation, he was righteous and wholehearted, but not relative to those of other generations. This is like a barrel of wine placed into a cellar where vinegar is stored. In its place, the wine's fragrance is noticeable relative to the odor of the vinegar. But when it is not there, its fragrance is too subtle to be sensed. Reish Lakish says, on the other hand, in Noah's generation, he was righteous and wholehearted despite being surrounded by bad influences. All the more would he have been considered righteous in other generations. This is like a flask of perfume in a trash dump. Even there, its fragrance is sweet despite the bad smells, and all the more so would it be noticeable in a clean place. How do we understand good people in dark times? People who stand up for what they believe to be right and true, despite the slings and arrows of outrageous opposition. And how should we evaluate someone who is part of the system and yet wants to work against the system? Are they using their privilege for good, or are they corrupted by their privilege in a corrupt system? My bar mitzvah growing up at the Birmingham Temple in Humanistic Judaism was focused on a hero rather than a Torah portion. My hero's name was Raoul Wallenberg, who was a Swedish diplomat who saved Hungarian Jews during the Holocaust. He was born to a life of banking family privilege. His family had run banks for over 80 years in Sweden by 1944. Sweden itself was neutral during World War II. It was not directly occupied by either power. And yet, without the requirement to serve in an armed force or even to do anything but enjoy his life, Wallenberg voluntarily put himself in danger. He wound up rescuing tens of thousands of Hungarian Jews, and ultimately he disappeared into a Soviet prison after the war, most likely killed by them in 1947, but never confirmed to be seen alive again. Now, unlike Wallenberg, privilege was not forecast for Helen Gavronsky in South Africa for generations before she came to live. Jews were not numerous in South Africa until the British period in the early 1800s, the first congregation being formed in 1841. The Boer Dutch settlers had landed there in 1652, establishing the Cape Colony, and they were strict Calvinists, Protestants. And despite Jewish investors in the Dutch East India Company, Jewish settlement was generally discouraged in Boer Calvinist areas. In fact, in the Boer republics, which existed from about 1857 to 1902, Jews and Catholics were not allowed to attend state-sponsored schools. Certainly no separation of religion and government. But in the aftermath of the Diamond Rush after 1867, when many Jews moved to the Johannesburg area to be able to provide support and business for the mining operations, and sometimes even direct investment in mining operations, such that the founders of the De Beers diamond cartel were in fact Jews. And then after 1886, a gold rush further west in South Africa, and ultimately direct British occupation led to a much more substantial growth in the Jewish population of South Africa. In 1880, there were only about 4,000 Jews in South Africa. And by 1914, there were 40,000 Jews in South Africa, many of them having come from Lithuania. If you have family background who are Litvaks or Lithuanian Jews, like I do, they are your Landsleip. They are people who came from where your people came from. And another 20,000 made their way there between 1920 to 1930. So you wind up having a substantial population, mostly Lithuanian background Ashkenazi Jews, and many of them living either in Cape Town or in Johannesburg. By and large, South African Jewry was politically moderate or liberal. They tended to vote for the opposition parties, like the Union Party or the Progressive Party, rather than the pro-apartheid, Boer Calvinist National Party. That's the party of apartheid. But one might ask, why did it take the rabbinate of South Africa and the official Jewish Board of Deputies until 1985 to formally issue a condemnation of apartheid? The official claim of the Jewish community of South Africa was that it was not a Jewish issue. Well, there are a few reasons why they might have chosen to be quiet on that topic. For one, the Jewish community of South Africa was and is very pro-Zionist and pro-establishment of the State of Israel. And they appreciated that South Africa had consistent and very positive ties with the State of Israel. It's a bit of a shame to us from the outside that Israel was a supporter of and supported by the South African apartheid regime. But on the other hand, for those who are in favor of a strong Israel, that was a plus. Secondly, Jews in South Africa had generally been successful in business and in industry, despite some Afrikaner anti-Semitism, and we'll see some examples of that in a little bit. But generally, the Jews were accepted as white. And in a society with a stark gap between the white and the non-white, the whites were able to glean some of those privileges and advantages, and Jews were included in that. And so rocking the boat perhaps was not in their parochial interest. And a third reason that may have contributed was that Jews in South Africa were more traditionally religious than most American Jews. At the peak population of South African Jewish population around the 1970s, there were about 120,000 Jews living in South Africa. They were only 0.5% of the 22.5 million people in South Africa. I think around 2 or 3% of the white population. But of that 120,000 Jews, only 11,000 identified with the Reform or Progressive Jewish movement. What we would call Reform, they call Progressive. So it was only about 10% of the Jews identified as Reform Jews. The percentage was much higher in America in that time period. And so perhaps they were less willing to rock the boat, but there were Jews, individual Jews, even some small Jewish groups who were willing and even eager to rock the boat. For example, Nelson Mandela's defense attorney was Isaac Maisels, a Jewish person. And all 5 of the white members of the African National Congress who were arrested in 1963 for anti-apartheid activism were Jewish. And of course, our hero for this evening, Helen Suzman, née Gavronsky, was born in a South African mining town to Jewish parents in 1917. I was fortunate enough in my research to find a wonderful online exhibit of her life, including lots of pictures and quotes by her, that was presented by the University of Cape Town's Jewish Studies Department. And so I'm going to use that as a template background for exploring her life, so you can see some pictures of her in action, while we're also having a chance to talk about the work and the legacy of the work that she did. And so here you have Helen Suzman with her pen in hand and a report developed called Race Classification in South Africa that represents one of her major projects in life dealing with the apartheid experience. Here's a picture of her in action speaking in Parliament with her handwritten notes, as we'll see, and one of her quotes from a award ceremony she received. She's proud to be a liberal who adheres to old-fashioned liberal values like the rule of law, universal franchise, free elections, a free press, free association, guaranteeing civil rights, and an independent judiciary. So these are some of her family roots. As I mentioned, her parents came from Lithuania. Her father came from a small shtetl that lived on the border between Lithuania and Latvia, and they met in South Africa, actually. They both traveled there through Europe, through Western Europe, specifically through England. And Helen was born in 1917. You can see some of the documents from the family in the old country. And in fact, this is Helen's father, Samuel, and his brother, Oscar, married 2 sisters. Now, Helen was born, as I said, in 1917. Unfortunately, her mother died shortly after she was born. The caption on the picture at the left, which shows her biological parents, she only saw that photograph of her mother when she was 55 years old, because this was the past. And her father remarried when she was about 9 years old. And so she had siblings that were much younger, and she had the experience of a stepmother as well. But she grew up as a relatively privileged person in South Africa, and a white person in South Africa, Her father, in fact, was a relatively successful businessman. It was a traditional Jewish home, as this document describes. And here you see the Samuel and Deborah Gavronsky Surgery Hall that he endowed at the Jewish Age Home. He felt a sense of obligation to contribute to Jewish charities. In terms of Helen's own identity as a Jew, she always identified as Jewish and was identified by the outside as well, but her identity was a secular Jewish identity. And so perhaps that gave her some sympathy for others beyond her community, not just her own experience. And certainly when she talked about her motivation for the work that she did, she would definitely connect Jewish experiences of persecution to her resistance against discrimination. Helen went to university actually at age 16, and she began studying for a degree in commerce, what we would call a business degree. But she interrupted her studies after her third year, or during her third year, to marry Dr. Moses Suseman, who was actually 14 years older than her. And she shortly after had daughters. They were married in 1937, and her daughters were born in 1939 and 1943. In between the birth of her daughters, by the way, she went back to college and did actually finish her degree. So a sign of her dedication and her commitment to education and knowledge was definitely an important part of her early biography as well. So there's a picture of her wedding on the left. And her political awakening really took place after the Second World War. She began to work in research institutions. She was a lecturer in economic history at the University of Witwatersrand, and she was a member of the South African Institute of Race Relations. She prepared something called the Fagan Report, that explored the issues of Africans in urban areas. Where Africans were in their own sort of tribal homelands, there was one dynamic, but if they moved to an urban area where they may or may not have had the right of residence there, their position was even more precarious. And this research for this project really opened her eyes to the challenges of Black workers in urban areas, particularly after the National Party, as I mentioned, that Boer apartheid-oriented party was elected in 1948, and began establishing the basis of apartheid. For example, in 1950, they passed something called the Population Registration Act that broke up the population into 4 clear areas: white, colored, Black, and Indian. And you had to be in one of those categories, and each category had different rights and privileges and rights of residence. There were also bans passed even before this law, banning interracial marriage and even banning sexual relations across the color line. It was called the Immorality Act, that ban on sexual congress. And eventually in 1953, they passed a law called the Separate Amenities Act. You could also call it the Separate but Unequal Act. It allowed for separate public provisions for the different racial groups, including benches, buses, hospitals, and schools. And as we know, if they were separate, they were certainly not going to be equal. Helen became politically active around the same time in 1953, when she became a member of the United Party and ran for a particularly safe seat in the Houghton constituency, which is actually where a number of relatively affluent Jewish families had wound up living. She was elected initially in 1953 on the Union Party ticket, but the Union Party was a problematic home for her. In fact, in 1953, the Union Party, even though it was on the liberal end of the spectrum, supported that Separate Amenities Act, that separate but unequal act promulgated by the National Party. In fact, during that vote, she was so upset that she and another member of the United Party walked out of the vote and refused to participate in a vote to establish apartheid in such a visible and strong way. And you'll see a headline here, Tensions Within the United Party, that describes some of those challenges she had living on the progressive end of the United Party caucus. Her first speech in the House of Assembly was on the Matrimonial Affairs Bill. And as we'll see, women's rights, in particular the rights of Black women, and an early concept of intersectionality were very important to her advocacy as well. As it says, it was a lonely but busy time for her. After all, she had 2 small daughters who had been born relatively close to her election, and she found time to fly back and forth because, of course, the Cape Town life in 6 months a year meant she left her family behind in Johannesburg. But she managed to be both a mother and a member of the House of Assembly in a time, again, when it was very unusual for women to be in such a public role. Here are some examples of the challenging laws that were passed by the National Party to make the apartheid system so in depth. You have, as I mentioned, the Separate Amenities Act, but you also have a rule on native labor. You have a criminal law amendment. You have the Riotous Assemblies and Suppression of Communism Amendment Act. They actually banned being a member of any kind of communist organization, and even the threat of being accused of being a communist sort of cowed the liberal end of the political spectrum. The Native Trust and Law Amendment Act, the Black Labor Settlement of Disputes Act, the Group Areas Amendment Act, which required people who belonged in those native tribelands to go there, which were later defined as Bantu areas. Of course, the Bantu areas couldn't necessarily vote in the national elections. And so the question of universal franchise was also one that Helen would advocate for very strongly, although, as we'll see, in a more complicated way. You see the Immorality Act here in 1957, and the Promotion of Bantu Self-Government Act, which of course is a newspeak, Orwellian 1984 speak for let them govern themselves, but don't let them vote in our own election or allow any of the people they would vote for to stand for them. In fact, at one time, the colored population, remember there was white, black, Indian, and colored. The colored population was only allowed to vote for white people who would serve on their behalf. They couldn't even represent themselves in the National Assembly. Well, you notice those United Party years for her end in 1959. What happened in 1959? Ultimately, in the 1958 general election, the United Party had a poor showing. They blamed the liberal wing, and so she left. She and a number of other colleagues did not resign their seats and decided to create a new party called the Progressive Party. There was her and there were 12 other members initially that left the United Party and created this new Progressive Party. However, after another year or so, the National Party decided it was to their advantage to call a quick election. And so they called the election in 1960 in the aftermath of some disturbances and riots and shooting of peaceful protesters. For example, you see pictures here from the Sharpeville massacre in 1961, the banning of the African National Congress. All of that led to a snap election called by the National Party for October of 1961. And as it says here, the timing was perfect. They increased their majority, and the only Progressive Party candidate who made it to the National Assembly was Helen Suzman. So she was a left-wing opposition party of one person. The other 9 party members running were defeated. She was the only one left, and she herself only managed to win by less than 600 votes. And she comments here, I was the only one who really wanted to get out. Politics made me sick. I saw no hope for the future. But I thought I might as well go down with flags flying, and no one tiny flag fluttered only by some 500 votes. It was me. She was the only one left. And so for the next 13 years, from 1961 until 1974, she would be the only member of the Progressive Party in government through a couple more elections where they again failed to elect anyone other than her. She was a one-woman show. But over those 13 years, as the only person in parliament representing this liberal perspective, over 13 years, she gave 885 speeches, and she posed over 2,200 questions to the government. One of the reasons she was so active was that sometimes the only way to get the word out about apartheid abuses in a setting of press censorship and communism accusations and the concept of being a banned person where you could not speak in public, could not be quoted, could not even meet with more than 1 or 2 people in private. Well, in that world of a security state, sometimes the only person who could get the word out would be someone in parliament speaking that truth. And often that person, lonely, was Helen Suzman. And so we can see here her workload was prodigious. In her first session alone, she made 66 speeches, moved 26 amendments, and put 137 questions to the government in mandatory question time. Famously, she was accused of asking questions just with the purpose of embarrassing South Africa overseas. Her response, you can see quoted here on the bottom left, "It is not my questions that embarrass South Africa. It is your answers." If they were truly a liberal democracy, they would have had an easy time answering those questions. It was the reality that was the problem. And she also later commented, by my own count, most of the questions I asked concerned treatment of Black, colored, and Indian South Africans. I'll point out, most of those did not have a voice or representation in the assembly. She spoke for them. She often went to the townships themselves, and she used her parliamentary immunity to go to places and draw attention to issues that others could not. She even went in to visit prisons, including famously visiting Nelson Mandela on Robben Island and showing him that she was not alone. In fact, Mandela himself commented, it was kind of odd to look out of our cell and see this white woman wandering around and coming up and talking to us in the middle of this prison, but she came to draw attention to the reality that was there. She also would attend demonstrations. She would attend protests. She would even attend funerals in an era where all mass protests were banned, and funerals were the loophole they used to have mass protests and to give fiery political speeches. She would go to bring attention and hoping to reduce police interventions. If she were not there as a prominent, famous parliamentary member, white ally, it might have been much worse. This is actually an early expression, just as I mentioned, of the concept of intersectionality with focusing on Black women, the concept of allyship, where white people use their privilege and protection to help Black activists do their work. Suseman herself said of her workload, which was unrelenting, and you can see here examples of how she used the press to get attention. In fact, the funny quote that's in this page, the United Party said, "You're just looking for publicity." And the government in particular said that about her. Her response was, "If you say something worth repeating, you'll get publicity too. So up your game," she would challenge them. And in fact, you can see in some of these political cartoons how she seems to tower over the national government, even though she's a one-person party. She called herself the ombudsman for all, or another self-titled quote was, "the honorary ombudsman of the dispossessed." She received letters from people all over the country, from all kinds of constituencies, asking for her help dealing with pension issues, legal justice issues. Here are some examples of her campaigning, even though, again, the elections were failures for her time and again, until finally in 1970, I think this was 74, she managed to get other people elected. You can see that smile on her face after the election when other Progressive Party members were chosen. This is the first batch from 1974. Ultimately, she was able to form coalition parties, becoming the Progressive Federal Party. And then finally, you see in her last election there on the bottom right, the Progressive Federal Party caucus in 1988 is much larger than that caucus of one through which she fought over all those years. She certainly faced a lot of challenges taking these hard issues. She fought back not only on apartheid, but also on abolition of the death penalty, on women's rights, including reproductive choice, rights of women's property, matrimonial property rights, and divorce rights as well. She also challenged the rule of law, the civil liberties that we mentioned earlier, the security state, including the dreadful human cost of its race policies, as this document points out, and dealing with policing, and in particular, the security state that included brutality, torture, and even death in police custody. If you remember the 1980s movie Cry Freedom, which focused on the story of Stephen Biko, that was just one of the examples of the Black activists that were detained and ultimately killed in custody with almost no investigation and no justice for those who were killed. She said, and she said it very well, "You have to take a stand against something you know to be wrong, even if it was seen as problematic." And you see one quote here from the Minister of Colored Affairs, P.W. Botha, who would later become Prime Minister. "The honorable member for Houghton is in the habit of chattering continually. If my wife chattered like that honorable member, I would know what to do with her. There is nothing that works on my nerves more than a woman who continually interrupts me. She is like water on a tin roof." But as we'll see, the abuse and invective she received did not stop her. Here are some examples of her going to visit a township, for example. She points out, most white people have never been in a township. They know nothing about the overcrowded houses, the schools, the streets. They know nothing of the seething anger that has built up all those years. She bore witness to these realities and again brought attention to them by her willingness to go there. She dealt with issues of forced removal and resettlement, and you can see some other examples, pass laws and influx control. She remembered actually when she was a child, 9 or 10 years old, she as a white person could sign the pass for their domestic servant, who was an adult black man, so that he could be out after dark, after the curfew. Think of the realities encompassed in that one anecdote. And one of the ways that the security state operated was to check people's passes and to condemn them for not having their pass or for being beyond the territory they were allowed with their pass. It was like an internal passport control. Again, the visits to prisons I mentioned as well, including her visit to Robin Prison, even visiting people who were called banned persons or banished persons. There was a funny anecdote where she went to visit Winnie Mandela, and during one of those visits, the security police raided the house. They confiscated a bedspread that was knitted in the ANC colors. And so Helen wrote an article called The Subversive Bedspread that was published in the Washington Post, and a US congressman sent a replacement quilt from Indiana to Winnie Mandela. Again, a wonderful and sad quote: "My desk is the sad harvest of the seeds of apartheid." And so you can see all the letters that she's writing, the speeches she's composing, a selection of some of the letters she received asking for her help, handwritten sometimes on lined paper, defending the rule of law in opposition to the Terrorism Act and other security state measures. And I want to jump down just a couple of pages to some of the threats and attacks that she received in her work. This is a little further down. Here we go. So it was no secret that she was from a Jewish background, and this was often used against her, either in threatening letters that she received or in heckling that she put up with while she was in the parliament, and in public square spaces as well. So you can see quotes. P.W. Botha called her, "You vicious little cat." B.J. Vorster is depicted here looking for English speaking only, so threatening her her status in the territory. You hear Piet Koenhoff, a nationalist MP who was the South African ambassador to Washington. "She has one purpose only, and that is to stir up unrest. Finally, I want to tell her, and I know this will hurt a little, that I think she deserves a good hiding, that she should be spanked." You see another quote here telling her to shut up. An ex-gray shirt, that was the neo-Nazi party there, launches an anti-Jewish attack on her. She has some quotes here about the experiences, but here you see some of the taunts that were thrown at her. A traitor, communist, the lady from Lithuania, go preach in the synagogue. I forgive you, you are very naive, you are a woman. Yes, there are some good Jews, but you are not one of them. I don't like your screeching Jewish voice. And often she got them back with her very sharp wit. So here are a few examples of her bon mot. So Botha said, "The honorable member for Howden, it is well known, does not like me." She said, "Like you? I can't stand you." Botha again, "You try to break the law and you will see what happens to you." She said, "I am not frightened of you. I never have been and never will be. I think nothing of you." I love this line at the bottom on the left. Helen commenting on the United Party's collusion with the government's 1962 sabotage bill. "I saw a shiver running through the opposition benches, looking for a spine to run up and down." When asked why she made the claim, "One cannot divorce labor from the person that embodies that labor," and a nationalist PM said, "Why not?" She said, "Because the good Lord has decreed that when a pair of hands come to work in white South Africa, that pair of hands is accompanied by a black body." And one last example, asked in an anti-Semitic swipe, what were her ancestors doing when the Voortrekkers were taking the Bible to the savages on the other side? She replied, "They were writing the Bible." But here you see some other examples of a picture from the newspaper, marked up, anti-Jewish postcards. Here she's described as Helen Suzman, the Yiddish Bantu expert, House of Assembly in Cape Town. Most of it went straight into the garbage, she said. She kept only a few choice examples as demonstrations. And she also had a wonderful practice. She would get threatening phone calls and obnoxious phone calls at night. And she kept a shrill whistle by her bedside. So if the call came in and this person started saying terrible things, she would go bleep into the mouthpiece and blow their ear off. And that was her way of getting back at them. Or my favorite example of her clever wit, she encouraged the prime minister of a particularly odious pro-apartheid iteration of the Nationalist Party. She invited him to visit a township in a heavy disguise as a human being, because obviously he wasn't. Here you see again her practicing her humanity in contact with Nelson Mandela before and even after his release. She traveled all over the world speaking about these issues, and she also received dozens of honorary doctorates, in the end over 27 honorary doctorates around the world. She was also nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize twice. Here you see some other examples of her being feted for her human rights work, list of her honorary doctorates from a number of prestigious universities, and some of the special awards that she received from various organizations, including the American Jewish Committee and the Wallenberg Award, again, very appropriate for a lone voice for justice. Even after her retirement, she was a force for good. Her early career had some, today, perhaps cringeworthy moments. You can find an interview of her on YouTube, for example, where she says she's not necessarily in favor of everyone voting. She wanted some kind of educational test for voting so that educated Black South Africans could vote, but not necessarily all the masses. She wasn't quite ready for that. So there's a kind of genteel, almost privileged, parochial, liberal benefactor message there. Later in time, she evolved a bit to be a little bit more open to the universal suffrage. In fact, so much so that in 1974, in the first universal emancipation election in liberated South Africa, Nelson Mandela appointed her to the commission that was overseeing the elections. And so she had evolved enough, in her view, to be able to be celebrated for that and to be included in that commission overseeing those first free elections. At times, she was also critical of the African National Congress post-Mandela, seeing it as pitting people against each other instead of bringing South Africa together. And she stayed engaged in public affairs until her death in 2009, some 12 years ago. As I mentioned, she received many awards and recognition, but there was also some controversy about her work as well, and we should note this. As one example, in the 1970s and early 1980s, she was actually opposed to sanctions against South Africa. She felt that maybe sports sanctions could happen, but economic and academic sanctions she didn't like. She wanted South Africa to be out there in the world, as she said, and that might be the way to push them. To quote The Economist in a review of a book about her, The Economist wrote, "She reluctantly endorsed sports sanctions, but resolutely opposed academic and economic ones. They made whites more blinkered and defiant, and blacks even poorer. Change," she said, "would only come if the country's rulers were forced to engage with the world outside." And there were some critics, even from her left, who were blameworthy of her, who said that she was part of the problem. She was standing in the way. The more radical voices, like the South African Communist Party or some parts of the African National Congress, thought that she was part of this corrupt establishment. A privileged white woman living in an affluent area who was a member of the House of Assembly. How could she be on their side? And she was collaborating with a corrupt regime. Mandela remained a fan, but this is part of the complex legacy of Helen Suzman. And so we can ask the question I started this presentation with. Was Helen Suzman righteous in her generation? It certainly was a wicked generation. But seeing how much she continued to speak her mind and to push for improvement even after the fall of apartheid, we can imagine that she would have continued fighting for what she believed to be right, even in less wicked times. She certainly was a woman of valor, as we read about in our Shabbat service this evening. She was certainly a role model for secular and humanistic Jews, a secular Jew fighting for justice against overwhelming odds. She was a light in the darkness. She was a positive force for good in the world. And so I'll end with selections from that Eshet Chayil, that woman of valor, in Proverbs chapter 31. A woman of valor who can find, for her price is far above rubies. Strength and dignity are her clothing, and she shall rejoice at the time to come. She opens her mouth with wisdom, and in her tongue is the Torah of loving kindness. Give her of the fruit of her hands, and let her own deeds praise her in the gates. That is truly the story of Helen Suzman.